All right, we are on to step 2, which is misconnections. Those misconnections in logic. I'm going back to the syllogisms of you've done A plus B plus C equals D, but maybe you've missed out on B. Something is not really matching up, or you've just skipped all the letters and moved to the conclusion. So slippery slope is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. When you assume that one thing will lead to several other things, and you're just sliding all the way down, jumping from A to, I don't know, R, and skipping everything in between. And a lot of times this is used in a very fear-based way. So I also call this the if you give a mouse a cookie fallacy. If this thing will happen, then this thing will happen, then this thing will happen, then this thing will happen, when really you're probably taking jumps and you're assuming a whole lot. Those of you who don't know this book, it's a wonderful children's book, and it has some good sequels, like If You Give a Moose a Muffin. Oh, I did not go my... Oh, I didn't go to my example. Where's my example? So what I saw recently was this argument. So your tax dollars shouldn't be going to school, blah, 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 blah. If your kid's school decides not to reopen, you should have a choice not to send to your kids. So the whole, like, reopening schools thing, and then jumping to we can't let an entire generation fall behind. It's like, whoa, how did you go from we can't open schools right now because of the coronavirus, we're going to have online learning, to we're letting an entire generation fall behind? And granted, people just aren't really doing as well with online school, and also the teaching isn't as good. I'm aware of that. But it doesn't necessarily mean the generation's going to fall behind. That is just supposed to scare people, pretty much. Something similar to this is hasty generalization. So the two seem very similar, but instead of sort of just making a claim and then jumping straight to the conclusion, this time you're looking at a really small example and then assuming that the worst, or that the conclusion will happen because of that small example, or an isolated incident. So last year, I think, or a couple months ago, I have no idea even what month it is, there was a National Geographic documentary. It's not a video, we're not going to watch it, that showed this polar bear that was emaciated and was just dragging itself on this prairie. And they used it as an example in their documentary to talk about climate change and the ice caps melting, things like that. Turns out that this bear was just really, really old, and it wasn't technically starving, but its image was used to sort of fit within this narrative. And so they used this one polar bear as an example of a larger issue, and so they had to go back and apologize. Another example lately, very lately, was when Trump was talking about how his polls are actually not bad, and he looked at, in particular, these boat parades and like for Trump and Trump supporters. But it's just like, okay, cool. You can look at that boat parade. You can look at that one march. You could look at those bikers. That doesn't actually mean that your polls are higher. So it was used of like, but look at all these people. All these people must mean that my polls are higher. So the logic just doesn't really match up. Same thing about vote by mail, which I am very pro vote by mail. I hope that something is figured out with that. But took the example of Paterson, New Jersey, 20% of the vote was corrupted. Even then, like, I want to know a little bit more about that 20% of the vote. We don't know if there's been another issue there, if it had to do with incompetence by the people counting it, or an error that occurred that had nothing to do with the actual mail-in process. Regardless, making this claim that it's going to be rigged and everything's going to be bad because look at this. Look at this one thing that happened. And so that's kind of an example-ish of the Texas sharpshooters. This is a particular research-based one where you're taking a data cluster to suit your argument. So this happens within research all the time, and sometimes it's very accidental. It happens when we're writing research papers, people going into any STEM-related field, especially with really complicated research and reports. It can be really easy to just take the data that works for what you're hypothesizing, or to show that there's a pattern that may not be there in the first place. So some other ways that this shows up, if you just sort of use like statistics or numbers, use like logos appeals without explaining what those are. So this is, I won't read the whole thing, but it's talking about Obamacare, about how you can keep your doctor and your plan, whatever. So there's some just random statistics here. Do you see what's going on with Obamacare? 28% increases, 37 in Texas, almost 60% increase. I have no idea what those numbers, increase in what? 37% of what? Almost 60% increase of what? So sometimes it's just leaving out information around those statistics. It can also show up if you have a loaded question or if you're stacking a question. So I was very bothered, even as a Hillary supporter, to see a lot of stuff like this. It was a poll that was on Twitter, and her all the categories, it was about Trump releasing his tax statements, like, why do you think he won't do it? And all of these are pretty negative. He doesn't pay taxes, he parks money overseas, he inflates his wealth, he's not very charitable. So it's setting you up to answer favorably. And it also happens, again, I mean, this is a good example of just basic Texas sharpshooter of right now, obviously, the economy's not doing great. But yesterday or 2 days ago, the chief economic advisor was like, look, we're in a housing boom. Our retail sales are having a boom. You're in a auto boom right now. But that's just if you look at these numbers compared to numbers from like a month ago. So it's not that we're in a boom in general. Like, these are relative to what our numbers were still within the corona pandemic. So just not being very careful with the kinds of information you put out there, which, granted, like, not everybody has the time to break things down completely. But if you have a position of authority, especially if you're talking to larger groups, you do have a responsibility to present that information accurately. Probably my favorite one to say, post hoc ergo propter hoc. You feel so smart when you say it. So again, the faulty logic of concluding that if this thing happened before an incident, then that incident must have been caused by that thing. So we could look at autism. Autism is like ripe with this kind of stuff. I just absolutely hate this graph. Somebody was trying to make a claim that organic food sales may cause autism. So they made this little chart. You're like, whoa, it went up at the exact same rate. But also, that we could look at the same thing with just like, I don't know, generations of iPhones and their technological progress. You could just grab a whole bunch of random things, and just because that thing happens to rise or happens to occur before something happens, it doesn't mean that it caused that thing. So I hate this kind of stuff. Fauci, as much as I love him, was caught up in some of this earlier. There were some early claims that there are these pre-existing conditions, a lot of which have to do with obesity, that complicate coronavirus or make you more likely to get it. And it actually ended up being pretty damaging. It increased fat phobia in a lot of ways. It lessened the ability for a lot of doctors to look at cases objectively when somebody was significantly overweight. And so it was this cart before the horse thing that wasn't necessarily backed up at all. And that research became, excuse me, irrelevant very quickly. False analogies. So analogies are great. Analogies help us understand things really well. I love analogies, but you've got to make sure that those two things have some sort of reasonable comparison. It can get really, really dangerous. So one that's been bothering me a lot is comparing coronavirus to the flu. Now, like, I get it. The symptoms are similar, but there's a lot of danger in comparing coronavirus to the flu. We think of the flu as something that only people who are older get. The flu, I had the flu last year because I forgot to get a flu shot, and it sucked, but I got over it, and I wasn't afraid that I would take a weird turn and I'd have to get a leg amputated or be on a ventilator for a month or etc. So it's very, very different and can cause a lot of damage if people just aren't taking it as seriously as they should. One that really bothered me recently was somebody comparing people protesting stay-at-home orders to a modern-day Rosa Parks, who, of course, during the civil rights movement, challenged whites-only, blacks-only areas by sitting on the bus in a whites-only area. They're protesting against injustice and a loss of liberties. That's not good at all. In fact, that's pretty horrible to say. So I would even say that this ends up being a moral equivalency issue, that you're comparing these two things that is not the same injustice whatsoever. Usually with moral equivalency, you do have these two things that really can't be compared. So PETA does this a lot with their advertising, where they will compare, bodies, animals to humans, and saying that their death is the same. And it's just not. We do not exist on the same sphere. I'm very pro animal rights, but the death of my family would be a lot worse to me, I think, than the death of a pet, even though I would be racked. But this has come up a lot with the stay-at-home orders and get back to work and things like that, saying like, well, yeah, people will die, but the economy needs to bounce back. And so there's a fallacious problem happening there. Especially we could go back to something like Texas sharpshooters. When we hear something like 99% will get through this and develop immunities, that makes it sound like pretty safe. But if we look at how many people there are in the U.S., that would be, at the very last line, downplaying the potential deaths of 11 million Americans, which is pretty terrifying. A terrifying number that is really reduced when you say, oh, 99%, we're going to be fine. Appeal to ignorance, believing that something's true just because it hasn't been proved false. Unfortunately, this is used. Where'd you go? There you go. Used a lot in religion, and it particularly bothers me. Like, I am a religious person, and there are whole schools of study that work to prove the existence of God or existence of certain things in a logical way. This argument is not it. I don't think it's going to go. Well, this video, no, it's not going to go. I was going to show a video that was at a briefing, a White House briefing about like new drugs. And Trump said like, well, we don't know if it's going to work, but like, what have we got to lose? Let's just do it. Who knows? And it's like, well, that's not really a good argument to make for using something. Just saying like, well, we don't know it doesn't work, so we should probably try it. It's lacking that really important evidence. And lastly, non sequitur, whereas it literally there's no train of logic there. At least with a red herring, you can kind of see how they got there, even though it is a distraction. So Vicky, in the last episode, she did not do a very good job. But at least she was still talking about the election. She was talking about the candidates. It's not like she started talking about ice cream that came out of nowhere. So conspiracy theories end up being non sequiturs because there's literally no evidence that connects it. But I saw this morning. I missed it from a couple days ago. America found a way to get a man on the moon. We can find a way to safely get students back in classrooms. I don't understand how those connect at all. In fact, if you can see a connection, please text me and let me know. But that strikes me as a classic non sequitur. And I can see he's just trying to say like, look, America is innovative. But we're talking about two drastically different departments and involves different kinds of money and innovation, etc.